So 10,000 photos later, I have in my hand the Canon 35mm f1.4 RF L-series VCM lens. I think it's the first lens that Canon's released with the VCM label. As much as I love equipment, I don't have my fingers on the pulse of everything all the time with when new things are released. But I have been waiting for a 35mm RF mount that was a red ring L-series lens. I've been shooting for a couple years now. I think basically since launch with the 35mm f1.8 macro lens, which for the price is well worth the money. I highly recommend it. It's only $500. This is $1,500 or $1,600. But I'm pretty sure this is the first lens that Canon has given a video use case label in the title of the thing. And that's for good reason. This is not a lens I would recommend for still shooters. And we'll get into the reasons why in a second. But let me start by saying my very, very first reaction holding this lens was not a good one. I don't know if you can hear this sound, but there is a floating element. I think it uses some sort of magnetic coils inside this lens that when it's detached from your camera, actually feels like the thing might be broken. I was actually worried when I took it out of the box that it got damaged during shipping, but sure enough, when you attach it to your actual camera body, the magnets or whatever is kind of balancing this interior element kind of spin up and obviously activate, and the noise goes away. It's very similar if you have a newer RF camera body. The sensors, if you notice when they're off, they like jiggle slightly, and that's just because of the built-in IBIS. It's obviously turned off when the camera doesn't have any power, and then it spins up when there is power. So that was hit number one. I mean, it is doing that on purpose, but it makes me wonder about the long-term ability of this lens to hold up under a lot more abuse as a still photographer. Camera bodies just tend to be a lot more all over the place and not mounted necessarily to a tripod or a gimbal or something like that, as often as videographers. The next thing that I noticed right out of the box, that there's an aperture ring. Cool, that's great. Only available in video. So not so useful if you're a still shooter. Why is that a problem? Probably not a huge issue. I don't know a lot of photographers that use the manual aperture ring even when it's an option. And to be honest, the previous 35 1.4 EF mount L-series lens doesn't have an aperture ring at all. But can you see the image size difference? Of course, with the EF mount, you would need an adapter, which would make it a little bit larger, but the size and weight difference, you save a lot of room just removing the aperture ring entirely. I assume it's more useful for videographers to have an aperture ring, or why else would they bother to put it in there, but it just feels kind of like wasted space. The next thing I noticed, once this was attached to my camera body, multiple exposure mode was completely grayed out and disabled. Not available with this lens. Kind of weird. The next thing I noticed was that I could not disable image distortion correction in camera. Now, maybe this is just my own personal preference, but I really aim to try and get the visual representation of what I'm shooting in the back of my camera as close to what I know it's going to look like in the final RAW file that I'm going to edit. I don't shoot to edit the JPEG files ever, but I want to know both in exposure and distortion exactly what my images are going to look like. So I just want to jump right into Lightroom right now to illustrate why I'm so annoyed by this. No matter what you do, you cannot turn off distortion correction on the back of your camera. When you take a photo with this lens attached, it looks like all your lines and the edges are sharp and straight and everything's fine. But the distortion, no matter what I did, was always applied in correction. And the reason that's a problem is I use Adobe Lightroom Classic, and when you import the RAW file, it renders the undistorted original, which if we jump here into the editing section, hit reset, looks like this, which is laughably distorted. Now, of course, you can set up a preset. It's a little bit constrained though. You can't actually set up a preset that does just this per lens. You have to like save it as an overall thing, which is very annoying. I personally don't like applying profile corrections for distortion to every lens. It's just an extra step in the process of having to do something and wait for it to render. And I really personally like the natural vignetting and natural distortion of most lenses that I shoot with, but not this lens. This is way, way, way too much distortion. Here's a photo from a client session, and you can just see, like, the bokeh is fine, but man, that distortion is crazy strong. And we'll look at more examples in a minute, but I'm just gonna snap that. You can see what it corrects for. Now, that might be fine to a lot of still photographers to just, yeah, I'll apply the distortion correction and be done with it. The issue that I really have with this is that in order for it to correct for the distortion, it has to be cropping in. So losing some aspect of your resolution to get to this state. Now, it's really tricky because if you use the profile distortion correction in Lightroom, it still shows you 6,000 by 4,000 pixels, which is the native resolution of my camera sensor. I can export it that. It shows up in the metadata and in the file as being 6,000 by 4,000. But it doesn't make sense. There must be pixels being padded or some kind of upscaling occurring. But to my knowledge, there's no AI upscaling feature in Lightroom. So something weird is shifting with the pixels, because if you manually apply distortion correction, which I'm going to do right now, to eyeball it to be about the same, you can see this weird liquefied white space. It's literally like liquefying the images and kind of compressing them in on each other, which might not be that big an issue, except for when you say constrained crop, you do see the real life implication of that. 5606 by 3738. You're no longer getting access to your full native resolution on your still camera. And that is a big trade-off that is not at all discussed in their marketing. Maybe camera manufacturers are just presuming that users have enough resolution now. I mean, I can't imagine most prosumer professional camera sensors being less than maybe 30, 28 megapixels from now into infinity. So maybe they just don't care. But it's a weird trade-off that I really don't want to have to think about ever in my work. Or again, correct for, because what's weird, the distortion here looks pretty good at like, where are we at here? Plus 26. But if I reset the crop and reset all this, look at the edges here. I'm right about near the edge of the right side here, right about near the edge of the left side. So I'm going to manually correct. Let's turn off profile, manually correct for distortion until it's about the same crop in. Something like this. Again, not scientific, just eyeballing it. It's just weird. It's just hard to match in a way that it makes sense. And then additionally, because you're beholden to using these profile corrections that you can kind of tweak, and maybe there's a way to make your own custom one. Again, I don't care that much about distortion with most lenses that I shoot with, so I haven't looked into it. But I mean, obviously you can change the amount, but you're beholden to the creator of this profile to be true and accurate to correcting for exactly what Canon thinks it should be looking like on the back of your camera. I don't like that mismatch. I don't know, maybe somebody knows in the comments if Canon provides the lens profiles to Adobe. Maybe it's a slightly different story there. That still does not, fix the fact that you're losing actual resolution for what you're finally getting in a print, or if you want to crop in. I did another comparison of this exact same background with the 35 1.8 RF, the macro lens. With more or less about the same framing. This is with distortion correction off, so I would call this extremely acceptable. Yeah, that's a big difference. And then I took one more picture. I'm standing in the exact same spot, holding the camera on the same, exact same area. This is the 35 1.4 EF mount, and the distortion on that is very, very acceptable. So my best guess is that lens manufacturers, I don't know much about the physics of lenses, but my best guess is that they're able to make a smaller, lighter lens, correct for something like focus breathing in videography, and get extremely good stabilization by having smaller lens elements at the trade-off of having more distortion in the raw footage. And the trade-off for that is having to correct for it, losing, essentially cropping in camera. They've shifted the stabilization of a couple years ago, where you'd have to like crop in 1.2 in camera, to now having more distortion and you having to crop in anyway. They're kind of cheating in a way that I just don't think is acceptable for a lens that's this expensive. optically and every other way, it's a fine lens. It's very sharp. The bokeh render I would characterize as being almost swirly in that way that a lot of photographers really kind of appreciate. This is totally subjective, by the way, so everybody's going to have a different opinion, about that. But let me turn off look at that distortion. It's crazy. This is against obviously a cinder block wall. That's just crazy, and it doesn't even look like it's correcting straight at all. Let's just scan through some more images. These are unedited, kind of straight out of camera for the most part. Let me edit this one from scratch. So just a little outdoor shot. These are mostly unculled as well. Yeah, I mean, the bokeh, obviously the distortion is, there we go. We can correct for it here. The bokeh render, it's fine. It's extremely, extremely sharp. I would say, like, perfectly representative of the sharpness I would expect from an RF mount L series lens. Let me go back a few to some like different sort of light sources. The color render is really nice. No complaints whatsoever. And not every shot is the distortion that distracting or problematic. Like here, doesn't bug me nearly as much. In fact, it looks even weirder when I have it applied. But that disconnect between sometimes it looks fine, sometimes it doesn't, what I'm seeing in the back of my camera doesn't match what the raw file is going to show me when I'm finally editing. It's way too much of a disconnect for me to be happy and really keep this lens. If you're a videographer, the lens distortion that gets corrected in camera gets applied no matter what. And I tested this with my R3 body, which lets you film in Canon RAW, C RAW, and the raw footage in that does have the distortion correction applied. And the actual stabilization and like panning effects are rock solid, super, super stable and impressive. So if you primarily shoot videography, yeah, I would recommend this lens. It's actually a very similar opinion that I had with the Canon 85 f2.0. Highly recommend it for videographers. Don't really recommend this much for still shooters. But the fact that like Canon essentially said this in all their marketing and gave it a label, I don't actually remember what VCM exactly stands for, but the fact that Canon has gone out of the way to label it gives me hope that they're working on a 35, perhaps a 35 1.2, or bare minimum a 35 1.4. That's specifically for still photographers. That's maybe smaller without an aperture ring or has some, like still shooter focused. And though personally, I don't shoot 35 millimeter often at all. I'm a 24 and 50 millimeter shooter. But if I had to shoot just one lens across an entire wedding, and some people are confused by this answer, I would actually choose a 35. And then why wouldn't I shoot 35 all the time? Well, I don't have to choose. By default, I can buy and use whatever I want. I prefer the dynamic range of a 24 and a 50, and I prefer the physicality of where those two focal lengths put me relative to my subject. The 35 would be the way to go if I could choose just one focal length, because you can get just wide enough for room shots and larger group shots, and you can crop in camera and get closer to get tighter, more portrait style images. It's still a little wide overall, but yeah, 35 or maybe a 40 would be my way to go. So it's a lens that I enjoy and I bring with me to most weddings, especially if I don't bring a zoom lens or something. But right now, if you primarily shoot still photos and use 35 and want the look of a 1.4 aperture and you want something small and lightweight, I would just go with the EF mount. Even through an adapter on an RF camera body, the autofocus is going to be stellar. And unless you're cropping in a ton, the sharpness on these older series lenses is still going to hold up mostly fine. I mean, not quite as sharp as the new 35 L series, but more than sharp enough for the vast majority of what people are going to need. Okay, so I did take a few pictures with the aperture stopped down just to see what the Sunstar would look like, and ignore my dirty sensor. But yeah, it's got 1 million blades in this sucker, so you're getting a ton. The exact number of blades in the aperture determines how many blades you're gonna have in your Sunstar, and this has a lot. I personally prefer fewer blades in my Sunstar, but that's just my own preference. Now, I will say this was a perfectly clean lens, and at just the right angle, I was still getting this kind of weird flicker. Like, look between this image and this image. Flare kind of disperses and breaks off in a slightly different way that I didn't expect. It almost looked like there was water or a droplet on my lens, but there definitely wasn't. And then this is shooting into the sun at f1.4 again, just straight up. So there's not a whole lot of flare, which I actually think is kind of a bummer. I like natural flare in my lenses, but you know, there's just no hope. Here's some closer up shots, a bit more of a macro vibe. It won't get anywhere near as close as the 35 1.8, but you can get a sense of sort of the bokeh here. These are all distortion uncorrected, by the way. Let's see what it looks like corrected. Yeah, you just lose so much. And I swear the profile is looking worse and worse to me the more I apply it. It's like stretching things in a weird way. Okay, and then another sort of close up. This is as close as I could get to this stick before I was so close that it was blurry. Something around right here. Look at that distortion. That's just wild. Overall autofocus performance, excellent. Really, really good. And I would hope and expect that because mirrorless cameras, even if you're shooting at a smaller aperture, it opens the aperture as wide as the lens can go to acquire autofocus, and then it'll stop back down. Or if you're shooting wide open at 1.4, you're getting way, way more light in there than a 1.8, which simply allows for way better autofocus accuracy, especially in low light or when using flash or something like that without any, like IR assistance. Yeah, the autofocus performance and tracking is just absolutely top notch for this lens. No complaints there whatsoever. So I'm gonna leave it at that. If you have any questions at all, feel free to let me know. I'm probably gonna send this back. I still can't decide. I take enough video of like products that maybe I'll keep it. But to be honest, I've been very happy with just my old 35 1.4 EF. And it's a lot cheaper, a lot less expensive. The trade-offs I don't think warrant this being 3 or 4 times the cost of what the other options that are available to you now provide. So those are my thoughts. If you're a videographer, definitely buy it. If you're a still shooter, don't. Thanks everyone. Let me know any questions or thoughts in the comments. And as always, thank you so much for your attention. Bye.